Welcome back to the Wide Awake Media podcast. I am your host, Dee Denslow, and we're here speaking to people who wish to understand the true nature, origin, and limits of knowledge. Today's guest is Nick Hudson. Nick is a private equity manager, actuary, applied epistemologist, and chairman of Pan Data, a leading independent organisation promoting major shifts towards greater human agency and flourishing societies through multidisciplinary research, sense-making, and innovation fit for real-world complexities. And you can go and check out this website, pandata.org, on the interweb. Nick has been an outspoken of critic COVID policies, which he deems overwrought and damaging to the point of causing a great tear in the fabric of society, and who could disagree with that? But also the impact of groups like the Fabian Society, the World Economic Forum, and the powerful money men who have been instrumental over many years gradually ushering in the Great Reset and a New World Order. The deep state does exist. It is not a conspiracy. Nick, it is a great pleasure to have you on the Wide Awake Media podcast. Welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you, and happy to be here. Thank you for having me, Darren, and good afternoon or good morning or to your listeners, viewers, wherever they may be in the world.
Yeah, and it's great to have you on, and I meant it when I said it's a great pleasure to finally talk to you, having followed you on X. I alluded to a word that I've been practicing over and over for the last half an hour, epistemology, because it's a bit of a tongue tire for somebody who's a Janner from the southwest of England. Could you define that in a bit more detail for me, please? Because I think it'll be an important sort of linchpin or undercurrent for the conversation that we're going to have today.
Sure. Epistemology is quite simply the theory of knowledge, how we can claim to know things, what is the nature of knowledge, when we can be certain in our beliefs, if ever. And it's, to me, a very foundational topic. I'm not too sure how anybody gets very far in the sciences or indeed in the humanities without some kind of grounding in epistemology. It's been an area of, I would say, lifelong fascination for me, if you'll exclude my toddler years. And I have learned a great deal by thinking in epistemology, reading in epistemology, and in my career applying it. I run a reasonably successful private equity fund where the epistemology features quite significantly in terms of how we go about thinking about strategy, business strategy, and about organizational structure and incentives and the location of decision points in an organization. Questions around the extent to which one should decentralize a business, where, how to get the best out of people when it comes to the innovation and the generation of new ideas. What are we really talking about when we talk about idea generation, and what are the conditions under to which idea generation becomes prolific? So those are all areas of my commercial life where for a couple of decades now I have been very much an applied epistemologist.
And it would be good if, if younger studies, I'm talking secondary schools and even before that, this type of exercise in critical thinking was really encouraged in younger students, because maybe we might not live in the world that we have lived in the last sort of 6 years, a decade. You could probably go back longer. It might have been very, very helpful if people had these skills in interpreting information and examining knowledge during the COVID period. Now, you're based in South Africa, in Cape Town, I believe. Very quickly, what was COVID like there in South Africa?
Well,
the COVID period.
Legally speaking, we had the strongest lockdown in the world. It resulted in the biggest decrease in mobility if you measured it according to the movements of people's mobile phones. And it went on for an inordinate length of time. Very destructive it was. I think on social development indicators, South Africa's level of social development went back several decades to the apartheid era. So basically all the gains experienced in terms of living standards and well-being since the termination of the apartheid era were summarily erased over the course of 2 years, 2020 and 2021. And that's something that the media have never, and politicians have steadfastly failed to reckon with, the dishonest bunch that they are.
You've never had sort of any reckoning or apologies or, politicians or other institutions coming out saying, oh, we got it wrong, we shouldn't have locked you down. Nothing like that in South Africa?
No, and that is generally the pattern when it comes to propagandized narratives. And COVID was that. It was only a propagandized narrative. I'm aware that there are other people in the skeptic movement who believe that there was a virus called SARS-CoV-2 causing a disease called COVID-19, and that it was just the response that was wrong, and if only we'd done early treatment. Well, all of that is complete and utter nonsense. Those people are as confused as anybody who doesn't know how to think critically. There was absolutely no pathogen to react to, nothing spreading in the population. This was all an exercise in psychological manipulation by way of media management and propaganda. In the few places where excess mortality did occur, it was because the doctors had been propagandized into altering the protocols that they used to treat influenza-like illnesses, in the process murdering people in quite substantial numbers and furnishing the newspapers and the newsrooms with the media clips that they needed in the artificially overburdened hospitals that were created by that propaganda.
So you believe there was no pandemic, that there was no COVID
There was
virus?
absolutely no pandemic. No, and there are numerous dimensions of scientific and logical investigation along which one may proceed towards that answer. At an epidemiological level, there was no indication of a spreading pathogen. And when it came to human challenge trials, where they tried to infect people with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, those all failed. When it came to the distribution of mortality over time and over geography, all of those patterns didn't match the patterns of a communicable disease. And I could go on. I don't want to make the whole show about this issue, but there are probably a dozen dimensions that we may assess, and not one of them comes up positive for the actual existence of a pathogenic pandemic. The only one that has some kind of weak evidence that people will point to time and time again is the consequence of a spreading PCR test. But that test itself is a load of nonsense, completely flawed, not definitive of even of infection, let alone of disease. To call those tests a COVID test in the first place was a complete and utter lie. It had nothing to do with detecting disease. And that's the one little stat that everybody sticks to. But the PCR test was the main tool by which the fear was spread, in addition to obviously the shock and horror headlines and the little media clips of Chinese men dropping down dead in the streets. And that's where I say,
I fell for that to start with, Nick. The people falling dead, and it didn't help that social media was really, really boosting my tweets, as they were called at the time, and I was completely oblivious. I was walking straight into it, and I thought, oh, this is great, I'm getting loads of numbers, and actually I realized quite quickly, actually, to be fair, that it was all fake. Were there any excess deaths in South Africa during the initial stages of 2020 and the COVID pandemic?
It's a contentious point. Suddenly overnight, the measurement of mortality in South Africa was co-opted by a bunch of ideologically motivated quacks at an institute called the South African Medical Research Council. The South African Medical Research Council. They informed me in no certain terms that they were there to track the deaths that they knew were going to be coming. They were extreme in their advocacy of lockdown measures and masking mandates and all the absolutely absurd things that were done. And they became ideologically committed to proving that there was excess mortality. But of course, when the statistical organizations of government that normally report on mortality after a year or two's delay, not in a 5-minute basis, as we were led to believe was suddenly possible with the advent of COVID, as those organizations came through reporting mortality, there was no excess mortality to be seen, rendering us in the position of needing to assume that those quacks at the SAMRC were lying to themselves and because of that, lying to the general population.
And by extension of this, do you believe that viruses, or don't believe? I know you're not a medical person, but do you believe that viruses exist? And I've asked this question to Dennis Rancourt, and he actually suggested, without actually being 100, you couldn't say for 100%, but he thought that they didn't.
Yeah, so I don't believe that viruses, as described by the tenets of virological science, or mainstream virological science, exist at all. And by the way, I don't think it's much of a criticism of anybody to say, I know you're not a medical person and therefore you can't talk about viruses very much. If you speak to doctors out there, and you come at them with a modicum of knowledge about viruses, you realize very quickly that most of them know almost nothing about viruses, about the purported workings of the immune system, or indeed about pathogens in general. Their knowledge is too broad and too shallow in these areas. So I consider myself to know a great deal more than a very large proportion of doctors out there about the tenets of virology and the tenets of immune theory. And I think I can give any doctor who walks into my room a good run for their money in challenging some of the assumptions that they have floating around in their heads and the beliefs that they hold to be axiomatic.
I have no doubt about that, and it certainly wasn't a criticism. It's just my tongue wagging away. And you are correct, because I'm actually a chemist by training, just a high school chemistry teacher. In fact, I'm not even in the system anymore because I couldn't deal with the madness that I saw in the asylums here in the UK. And when I go to the doctors, quite often I have to advise them on some of the drugs and the chemicals that they're preparing to or proposing that I might take for whatever ailment it is that I'm in there to see them. Vaccines then. What was the purpose of the pandemic then? Why were we put in this position where we're all locked down, masked up, being told we needed to have a jibby jabby, every couple of months? What was the purpose of it?
Well, there are multiple purposes that are ticked off when it comes to a big mass propaganda event like this. And depending on who you are, you will evaluate one of those purposes as more important than another. But let's take a look. It's always important to adopt the position of looking at the side effects as the intentions when it comes to looking at events like this. The intention was not to protect the public from an actual pathogen. That was not the intention of the people at far up the chain of command. The doctors and the nurses and the teachers and your neighbor next door may have believed that they were trying to protect everybody else from a novel deadly virus. But the creators of the propaganda and the paranoia and the fear and the nudge units and all these kind of psychologically manipulative tools, that was never on their agenda at all. What did they achieve? Well, first of all, there was an enormous wealth transfer from the poor and middle classes to oligarchs all around the world, some $6 trillion worth. Then there was also the rollout of any number of control-oriented rules, regulations, patterns of behavior. And that was not confined to the actual strictures of lockdown and mask mandates and vaccine mandates. All sorts of social protocols that had previously placed protections around individuals vis-a-vis their governments were eroded. and kind of eroded to the point of never to be seen again. So if your orientation is to make money out of a scam, if your orientation is to exert greater control over civilian populations, then COVID was just the right thing. The side effects were the intention. And I think in a great measure, there was also an opportunity to test technologies of the techno-surveillance state that we see being rolled out in close succession in the wake of the COVID phenomenon.
There were two threads. There were like two tools that they used to convince the public to comply that there was this virulent pathogen out there, that, you know, it was the world's worst pandemic. Everybody was going to die. The fear was, you could feel it. You could feel that sort of tension in the air. It was a horrific time. One of them was the mainstream media, and one of them was science trademark. Who owns the message of the mainstream media? Who was pulling their strings and directing them to comply and lie to the public on a scale that's never been seen before?
Bankers. We can call them the transnational capital or the Anglo-American establishment. But the reality is that certainly for our lives and for several generations before, the world has been controlled by the people who control the banking system. And that hasn't changed in more than 100 years. And it is at their behest that the media produces the propaganda, at their behest that the politicians implement the rules, at their behest that the civil servants police the rules, at their behest that the medical schools and the World Health Organization chants their mantras and alters their protocols. So we should be under no illusions about that. It's a kind of perverse immaturity to believe that politicians honestly sit there responding to the pressures of the electorate, trying to bring to bear the will of the majority. The whole idea of democracy is illusory, and if you haven't woken up to that reality at this stage, then you need a serious dose of critical thinking, a little bit of epistemology in your life.
And it's basically the same sort of question with regards to science. You know, I'm going to say who controls the science. You're going to say the bankers. How do we get around this lack of scientific literacy within the public? And just like with the mainstream media, and just like with our diplomatic or political or democratic systems, are people going, I'm not interested in science anymore after COVID? Oh, the mainstream media have lost their influence over me. Oh, I'm not interested in voting anymore for the next person who comes along and says they're going to change anything. That indoctrination, how do we overcome it and have the people in power actually lost the narrative?
Well, look, I think we're asking for rather too much if we kind of hold ourselves to the standard of getting members of the general public to become scientifically literate. Scientific literacy is itself a complex story and very much a concern of epistemology, by the way. But what I would rather see than an attempt to try to aim for widespread scientific literacy, I don't think that's very plausible in the medium term, even or even in the scope of generations. Rather than that, what I'd like to see is skepticism about government. I mean, most people that you talk to are kind of familiar with truisms like, you know, how do you know when a politician's lying? Well, his lips are moving. Most people don't trust governments to do things properly or in their interests. But somehow, when the guy on TV got up and said, well, there's a novel deadly virus, everybody, and here's some pictures of a guy in China falling over, dropping dead in the street, they took leave of their senses, and they suddenly began believing the politicians whose lips were moving, even though they had never once walked out into the street in their neighborhoods or their towns and seen somebody dropping dead from a novel deadly virus.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't. I can remember going out probably. It was after lockdown, and I'd probably spent a couple of days in my home, and you was afraid to cough. in the shop as you was walking around. But it very soon became quite apparent that there was no pandemic. Nobody was ill. During the whole period, I didn't know anybody who had COVID. Were the streets of South Africa barren and dead like I experienced when I first went outside to go to the shop? Like I felt like I was doing something wrong. Were they like that in Cape Town?
Well, South Africa as a multicultural country with a long history of colonialism and apartheid is one of the countries in the world with an extreme distribution of wealth and income. And what happened was that the country bifurcated. All the wealthy and the small middle class in South Africa, which is disproportionately white, those people's areas and their schools and their streets were barren, and they were sitting cowering behind their laptops, digesting all of this claptrap on social media, insisting that their 3-year-old would only go to play school if wearing a mask or two, and rushing to vaccinate their nearest and dearest with a completely untested and fraudulently trialed genetic therapy. Those people behaved much like I imagine most people in the United Kingdom would have behaved, or in parts of the United States. But in the black townships, people had no choice. They cannot afford to be locked down. They have to hustle. They have to keep moving around in order to just sustain life. And so they just ignored it all. I visited the townships. I managed to declare myself an essential worker, so I could move down even under the strictest conditions of lockdown. I did that just under a loophole of the law. I was the CEO of the business. I declared my business partner an essential worker, and he declared me an essential worker. And so we completely ignored lockdown and moved around to our heart's content. I visited the townships. Everybody was moving around. Nobody was wearing masks. And nobody was dropping dead, coughing, dying, whatever. That was all complete nonsense.
Yeah, it was just so surreal. And when I went out, there was all the signage was up. It was like, wait a second, we've only been locked down for a couple of days, and they've got all these COVID signs and arrows on the floor and plastic sheeting in the shops that you could just stick your head round if you wanted to pay. Utter madness. Final bit on COVID, Nick. What's been the aftermath in South Africa? I've been speaking to people from all over the world. I'm sort of interested, as morbid and as macabre as it is, excess deaths since lockdowns have been lifted, since the vaccine program has been rolled out. Are people still getting vaccines in South Africa? Are they still being offered? They are in this country, specifically to pregnant women, which I find, absurd. And how has fertility been affected, if you have that data available to you?
Yeah, I mean, the offering of these injections to pregnant women is not just absurd, it's disgusting. It's a moral depravity. In South Africa, it was largely, there was two groups of people who were prone to taking a vaccine. It was white people and black people who worked in universities and government departments where it was mandated. And who faced a certain loss of livelihood and deprivation if they refused to take the shot. So that accounted for about 30% of the population. They lined up for either one of the J&J jabs or two of the Pfizer jabs. But 70% of the population said, we got your number here. Largely black people and a minority of white people, the ones who still had their critical thinking capacity intact, all said no to the vaccines. And that accounted for, as I say, 70% of the population. But by the time the first and second boosters came around, compliance had dropped to something like 1%. Nobody was taking the shots. It was rather strange because in my social circles, obviously I overlap with a great many people who were taken in by the propaganda, who fell for it all. Doctors especially were very prone to it because they come from an educational background that is all about protocols and all about respect for the World Health Organizations and the sort of medical system as a whole. That's all amplified by insurance companies, medical insurance or health insurance companies that try to codify and categorize all types of ailment and treatment and turn everything into an algorithmically driven kind of protocol. So doctors almost were, they were just cannon fodder in face of the propaganda. And I come across all these people all the time, and these are all people. Like, I don't know anybody in South Africa who's still getting boosters. So they've all made the decision. They've all come to the realization that the media was talking nonsense, that the World Health Organization was talking nonsense, that their medical institutions and universities were talking nonsense, but they've kind of memory hold it. They don't take the vaccines anymore, but they don't talk about it. They don't say a word.
They don't talk about it. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot more smarter people in South Africa than there are here in the UK. Although, I mean, it's hard to believe because it could just be propaganda, but people are still queuing up here for COVID vaccines. I know people who are into double digits now, and all their friends around them are dropping dead. Let's just change track now and. The political system. I listened to a speech that you sent me, that you gave, and you was talking about how there is a deep state, there are secret societies, there are the Fabians. Our Prime Minister here, Keir Starmer in the UK, is one of them. We've got the World Economic Forum and these other supranational organisations. We've got the Bilderbergs and the Trilaterals. Can you tell me more about them, how long their influence has been over our political systems and all of our institutions globally, and what their intentions are? Big question.
Yeah, look, I mean, all of the organizations that you mentioned were basically their origins can be traced to the late 19th century when an organization set up on two sides of the Atlantic. So on the eastern side of the Atlantic, you had an organization that came to be known as the Milner Group. That was established under the leadership of Cecil John Rhodes, who was a mining magnate from South Africa. Lord Milner went on to become governor of the Cape and High Commissioner for the Cape, which was at that stage a colony of the United Kingdom. And on the west side of the Atlantic, it was J.P. Morgan. The Morgan Group was established. And this happened, these two kind of secretive societies were established within weeks of each other on either side of the Atlantic. They had connections to the great banking families, the Rothschilds and the Morgans, as I mentioned. But as time went by, Carnegies, Mellons, Vanderbilts, Roosevelts, Rockefellers, they were all there and implicated in the same kind of, I don't like to refer to them as secret societies, but they definitely were secretive societies. And those societies began to rally around a movement that was nascent in the 19th century called Fabianism, named after the Roman general who was famous for having adopted a kind of delaying tactic in the Punic Wars against Hannibal, the conqueror of Carthage. And he was successful in his delaying tactics, and Fabianism was a kind of realization that revolutionary socialism was destined to fail. It would never be acceptable to the communities upon which you were imposing the revolution. And also that the actual economic theory of socialism was garbage, that Marxist theories didn't make any sense. And it was a movement built around those two realizations that attempted to take a gradualist approach to implementing social and political change towards a kind of socialist ideal or socialist image. And the Fabian Society was massively supported by these bankers in the Milner Group and the Morgan Group, and very rapidly began to transform British society and, as time went by, the world. And the talk that you referenced was my attempt to compress that 150-year history into 20 or 22 minutes, I believe it was.
What's their influence now? What's their aims? These secretive societies, the Fabians, for example. What are their purpose? How are they trying to direct and manage the global societies of Earth?
Okay, so Socialism, Fabian socialism, is defined by one thing and one thing only, and that is a large extent of state ownership of assets and income streams. And the marketing spin that was put on this was that this is somehow in the interests of the workers. You could vote for a party and the government would own the assets rather than those greedy capitalists over there. And it surprises people to hear that bankers were the main promoters of the system. But the reason they were promoters of the system is they had realized by then that it was absolutely easy for them to infiltrate governments and to actually control the levers of power of the state. And so, but they could package something as being all about workers' rights. The state would be the owner of this and that and the next thing. And what that did was meant they were actually getting control of their assets for free. Your taxes would pay for it, or confiscation from you as a private individual would deliver control of the assets to the bankers without them having to purchase them in the open market. And the whole idea that socialism, or indeed communism, which was supposedly a successor state of society to socialism, would be in the interests of the general public or the workers, is complete hooey. There was never any kind of schema laid out by which this control by workers would be achieved. And all it did was deliver huge, vast quantities of assets into the hands of the Anglo-American establishment, or transnational capital. And that was an ongoing and continuous process of some 150 years duration, which is ongoing today. These organizations that you mentioned, organizations like Chatham House or the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and the Council for Foreign Relations on the other side of the Atlantic, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, the World Economic Forum, all of these are kind of successor or affiliate organizations of the Fabian project. So we live with them today. The United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the predecessor to the World Bank, which was the League of Nations. All of these are the spawn of Fabianism. And so we very much live with them. In fact, you could drop a bomb on the Fabian society itself, and its progeny would carry on operating without even skipping a breath. So that is the extent to which they have been successful.
Are we seeing an acceleration of their ambitions right now? One, because we've got certain technologies, artificial intelligence, surveillance technologies, the computer technologies, and also because we've got these conflicts, two major conflicts, one in Eastern Europe, one in the Middle East. Are these tools to accelerate, let's call it, the realization of a one world government, new world order, and the Great Reset?
I think there are a great many people who believe this to be the case, and people on both sides of the fence. So people within these kind of creepy organizations, I think they believe that these technologies are accelerating, and a great many people who are of a skeptical mindset, people who I might call my fellow wayfarers, are also terrified of the prospect of acceleration of this kind of technocratic surveillance state, the control grid, and so on. And then there's a group of people who are terribly afraid because only recently did they become aware that their world is actually controlled by financial capital, and that their politicians are all puppets and actors pretending to do things on their behalf. And all that's a bit shocking for people who've come to that kind of awakening or realization. And so they perceive things to be accelerating. But I think of it all as more of a continuous drip of gradual movement towards a kind of highly centralized architecture of society. And because I believe that the great names of the Austrian School of Economics, people like von Hayek and von Mises and Rothbard, were correct when they said that highly centralized systems are doomed to fail, and that the amount of data they collected and the speed of their computers didn't alter that fact in the slightest. I don't see them as accelerating the implementation. I actually see them as just being tools that get us closer to the ultimate collapse that will come from the attempt to implement highly centralized systems of governments.
What will the ultimate collapse look like? Again, a bit of a
Well, the first thing that happens under centralization is knowledge creation becomes impossible, and the reason for that, and this is an epistemological reason, is that in the face of complexity, the only way we make progress is by way of conjecture and criticism, by trial and error. And what's the precise thing that centralization does is to outlaw trial and error. There is a protocol, and there is a spreadsheet, there's an algorithm, and you must comply with it. Otherwise, your social credit score goes down, or whatever the case may be. And so centralization, in and of itself, no matter where it is occurring, stifles knowledge creation. And without knowledge creation, you cannot have sustained economic growth. So the first thing that happens is problem solving comes to an end. And that's just the beginning. The next thing that happens is you start suffering from the law of unintended consequences, as the problems that the algorithms purported to solve begin to be swamped by the problems they didn't foresee themselves creating. And I think this kind of collapse is spoken about within the context of a couple of generations, maybe even shorter, given the far-reaching nature of some of the interventions that our would-be overlords are intent upon imposing. So I see it as, in the sweep of history, the collapse as being a relatively near-term thing. And I believe that we're beginning to see profound signs of it already, and a sort of an air of panic amongst elites, amongst people who are parts of these projects like the Tony Blair Institute and the United Nations and the World Health Organization and so on. I believe we're beginning to see signs of panic.
Is that what's happening right now with the Trump administration? Are they panicking? Is the USA realizing it's losing its grip and is panicking? And that's why we've got, you mentioned unintended consequences. We've got this conflict that's just sprung up in the last few weeks in the Middle East. Well, it's not just sprung up. It's continual. It's a continual process in the Middle East. But this time, maybe they've bitten off more than they can chew.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a fundamental error to regard Trump as deciding anything or having any say or any gravity in terms of the. No, that's all right. I just think the point can't be made often enough. All these MAGA people are just deluded that they think Trump is going to somehow lead them to the promised land or save them from the bankers or the globalists or whatever the case may be. No, he was only allowed to stand because he was completely controllable. And if you learn anything from the process of the Epstein files, which is just the tiniest portion of the window that you need to perceive, then you know that all of the leaders of these countries, from Israel to the UK to America, you name it, to France to Germany, that they're all under the thumb of transnational capital, and they wouldn't even be eligible to stand for election if that were not the case. So the question is, what are the bankers trying to achieve with this war? Because this is not the decision, or it's the intervention in Iran is not the decision of some political process in the United States. This is not the result of somebody electing somebody who decided something. That's got nothing to do with it at all. So the question is, why are the bankers waging this war theater? Because it's not war in the sense of conventional geopolitical analysis, two countries coveting the same resources, unable to work out a way to share them, and therefore going to war with each other. That's the story that we kind of receive from the textbooks written by these parasites. But it's not the case. This is a war that has vast potential for concentration, for further concentration of wealth. If you have pre-knowledge about the events, you can invest judiciously in commodities and disinvestment from them at the right times. You'll make untold quantities of money. And what we can say for sure is it's got nothing to do with regime change. It's got nothing to do with the rights of women. It's got nothing to do with political ideology. This is all about the accrual of power and the recasting of geopolitical lines of control.
In fact, there was an article that you pointed out on your X profile called the Straight Theatre. Do you believe that this is, because I mean, this clear, everyone thinks, oh, it's Trump, yeah, he's got playing 5D chess, this war will be over very shortly, and actually it's been planned out for decades and decades and decades. The documents exist. I paid quite close attention to Brian Berletic, who talks about this. Do you think, as the Straight Theatre Substack that I read this morning, it is all about redirecting trade routes, re-examining resources, maybe trying to hurt China? Is that what it really is all about? It's economics?
Yeah, it's about the industrial complex, finding ways to rebuild, build back better. Well, that's code for all that stuff that you bash down. We're going to make a huge profit building it up again, and you're going to pay for it, Mr. Taxpayer, wherever you may live, or Mr. Middle Class person. There's no sincerity to the objectives here. There's no casus bellum or belli, I think is the term correct, if I correct my own Latin here. And yes, so it's not, it is theatre. And I don't mean, here I'll quote Simon Dixon, who's a fairly interesting analyst in the United Kingdom. By theatre, you don't mean that there are no casualties or no deaths or whatever. There are real deaths and real casualties, of course, in these conflicts. But it's theatrical in the sense that we are led to believe that a conflict motivated by regime change or death to Israel or death to Iran or whatever, that kind of rhetoric, that's the motive, that those are the motives for the conflict, when in reality the motives are entirely economic and about stealing money from you and me and everybody else who's not a member of the great and good.
And it's incredible that the correlation of, this gas facility, LNG gas facility, it was due for, destruction or rebuilding or renewal, and we've just reinsured it. Bang, it's been blown up. And this is happening everywhere in the Middle East right now. It's almost like, it's not just one 9/11, it's a whole series of 9/11s of infrastructure that needs to be replaced. There's plans to replace, and now we've got this war and it's all being blown up. Is that actually happening? Was that a correct analysis?
Yes, the Iranians have been astonishingly good at hitting the buildings that were about to be demolished anyway. If you even believe the story that it is indeed the Iranians who are firing all the missiles, I mean, no doubt some of them are coming from Iranian territory, but I would imagine that every now and then that doesn't work out quite so well, and some American airplane has to go in and finish up the business. Now, that is surely happening. But yeah, I mean, and this is where it's just, I'm aghast at the extent to which people are still prepared to go along with the whole MAGA theory, make America great again. I mean, to my mind, these people are most seriously in need of a wake up. They need a bucket of iced water thrown over their heads and a good hard slap through the face. Goodness, I mean, what a bombastic idiot Trump was in the first place to believe that this person would have a good bone in his body and something to do in favor of you little minnow living in the backwaters of Texas or whatever the case may be. Honestly, to have believed all of that and not to have seen that he's just a bad actor. And I mean it there in the literal Hollywood sense of the term actor. He is a bad actor from The Apprentice, This is not a person who's had a lifelong passionate commitment to freeing middle-class Americans from the predations of the banking elite and the deep state. Give me a break. That was such a garbage story from the start. And now to believe that the reason he appears to be going back on his campaign promises of no more wars and that kind of thing, is he's playing 5D chess, Come on,
it's ridiculous. And the establishment preys on people's hope because they know that people realize, wait a sec, the world's not quite what it seems. And so they prey on people's hope. And that's how they get people like Trump into power. Somebody who's an extreme narcissist. And what makes it even worse with the MAGA people is that he was the one who introduced COVID, lockdowns, warp speed, the vaccines, everything. He was the man, the leader of the the free world, who is in charge, and yet he is still given leeway. And people go, oh, he's doing 5D chess, like we've said. It's mind-blowing. And it's worth noting, Nick, that there's a lot of people who follow MAGA, who are Trump supporters, who will see this podcast and will probably unfollow us as a result. Is Iran in on it? Is Iran in on it, do you think? Is Putin in on it?
Yeah, these are very interesting questions. And I tend to bias towards the answer that sort of, let's put it this way. A yes with some boundaries around it. When you say, is Iran in on it? Well, what do we mean by Iran? Is Khamenei in on it, or was Khamenei in on it? Is Khamenei dead? But was he in on it? Is the rest of the leadership structure of the RGC in on it? Are the Iranian people or some leaders in the society in on it, etc., etc.? Those are all different degrees of what we might consider Iran being in on it to mean. I think that Iran is in on it at a level high up the structure, that there is a kind of redrawing of lines of political control that has been pre-agreed. You're going to take this much damage, they're going to take this much damage. This is going to be the net result. America's going to lose its unipolar hegemonic status. I think so. It would be a brave man to say, I know so.
Yeah.
And I think even nations like China and Russia do struggle with the realities of trying to stay independent of the projection of Western power, of the power of the Anglo-American establishment. And from time to time, what the Anglo-American establishment is trying to do coincides with their interests, so they go along. It's difficult to read, and of course we are talking about incredibly complex phenomena where there are multiple agents with multiple ambitions and priorities, many of whom may be fooling themselves about certain things, like all human beings. I'm not a big fan of this idea that there's sort of a committee of 300 making decisions around this, completely hidden from public view. I do believe that the most powerful people are probably in the shadows. But that to try to describe the world in very clean-cut lines that are, hierarchical with a single pinnacle, I think that's all somewhat childish thinking. The world's a complex place. Power does accrue in a concentrated fashion, and I think it's fitting as an analyst or thinker to maintain openness to ideas about what is important from time to time, or who is important from time to time, and to, at the same time as one is trying to see the broad patterns of control by financial elites and erosion or insubstantiality of democratic processes, as much as you're trying to see that broad pattern, you must also remain open to the eddies and flows of actual complex manifestations of power.
And human nature. Could, for example, let's just say there's a plan in Iran, with this Iran conflict, you take out this installation, we'll take out this installation, we'll redraw our borders, we'll redraw trade routes, we'll attribute resources. Could it all go wrong? And in my mind, I can't help escape the fact that there are nuclear powers involved here. Iran could also be a nuclear power. We don't know. Could it all go wrong in the worst possible way?
See, I don't think nuclear war is a realistic scenario. I think this is one of the propagandized issues, a fear tactic, I've got a little saying that some people have dubbed Hudson's razor, which is that any problem purported to be a global problem, admitting only global solutions in the presence of suppression of dissent, is a scam. And the kind of nuclear threat would tick the boxes of Hudson's razor, the three the three boxes needing to be ticked being the global problem, the global solution, and the suppression of dissent. People who have questioned the nuclear narrative for whatever reason, some people question on the whole basis of the existence of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I'm not in that camp. But I look at it more from a pragmatic point of view. Who gains from a nuclear bomb going off? I mean, it's very difficult to tell the story of financiers profiting from that kind of event. So I tend to believe that it will not come to nuclear conflict, and that's not one of the things we should obsess about or be concerned about or worry about. That's my point anyway.
And it's something that I personally should take note of, because Hudson's Razor, probably a good name for this podcast, to be honest, because, I've spent many, many years warning that there is a potential for the use of nuclear weapons and it could go all disastrously wrong. Maybe that's from my time working on submarines. Final question, Nick, and it's a question I ask most of my guests. How do we win? How do we resolve our issues with the people who rule over us? Is there a way out? Are we locked into?
Yes, there is. Yeah, no, there is very much a way out. They have shown us how important it is to them that they control minds. And so the first way you win is by ignoring them. And you can really go quite far in this. I stopped watching television and reading mainstream media in the 1990s when I had an epiphany about how hollow and insubstantial it all was. And that has served me very well. I've had a successful business career. Absolutely haven't suffered at all from never watching the TV news or reading a single newspaper. Never. That has never hurt me. So that's the first thing, is ignore them. The second thing is buy fewer products from large corporations, products and services. Just trying to work out ways to cut 20% from the amount of money you spend on large corporations. And that can be just being a little bit more careful about which subscriptions you have ticking over every month to which services operated by X or Meta or Google or Amazon. Trying as hard as possible to shop from local stores rather than large chains. Buying your insurance company your insurance policy from a local startup rather than a huge multinational insurance company with arms sprawling all over the place. Investing your assets more locally and not with BlackRock or whatever the case may be. And then constantly reminding yourself to act local. Focus your attention on that which you can influence, on the things in your immediate surrounds. I think there's a pathology that comes with people who are black-pilled, if you like, or just red-pilled, who have begun to pierce the fog of ignorance and to realize how the world really works. They can become quite obsessed with consuming material about the various theories of how things are being managed and so on. And in the process of doing so, they disable themselves. They stop acting at a local level. They forget to serve on their local school board or to take an active role in their neighborhood in trying to establish a street committee or a social committee or whatever the case may be. Do something at a local level. You've got the capacity to do it. If you haven't, it's probably because you're over-consuming social media and watching too much TV.
And I'm certainly one of them. And that might well be one of the best answers to that question that I have had, Nick, on this show, which has been running for a good few months now. Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I'm sure my girlfriend's overjoyed that I've had a South African come on to talk to me somewhere very close to her heart. I hope that you take care, keep doing the good work that you're doing, and maybe stay off X because it's not good for you. And everyone else, everyone else who's listening.
Very good words. I should take some of my own medicine. Yes.
Yeah. It's so addictive. X, it's been part of my life for so long. It's so addictive. And, one of the first things I do when I wake up in the morning is I've got to see what's going on Twitter. And it's never good for you, is it? If you're listening to this show, thank you very much. Tune in, tune out, turn off, cut out Amazon, cut out X, shop locally. But whatever you do, please stay awake.